My family threw me out of the house on a Tuesday morning in February, 7 years ago. My father stood in the doorway in his bathrobe and told me I was a selfish, ungrateful disappointment who would never survive without his name protecting me. Then he closed the door. I was 24 years old, standing on a wet driveway in Nashville with 2 duffel bags and $38 in my checking account. 7 years later, my family walked into the lobby of my boutique hotel and demanded a complimentary suite. My name is Maya, and I am 31 years old. I am the founder and sole owner of The Laurel, a luxury boutique hotel in the heart of downtown Miami. Before I tell you what happened the night my family showed up uninvited, I want you to hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rebuild your entire life after the people who were supposed to love you tried to dismantle it instead. Trust me, you are going to want to hear every single word of this story. It was a Saturday evening in late October. The Laurel was operating at full capacity, which meant every one of our 42 rooms was booked. The rooftop bar was packed with guests. The Courtyard restaurant had a 2-hour wait list. I was in the back office reviewing the weekend revenue projections when my front desk manager, a sharp and unflappable woman named Priya, knocked twice and stepped inside with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She told me there was a situation at the front desk. She said a group of guests was demanding a complimentary premium suite and insisting on speaking with the hotel's corporate ownership. She said they were loud and were making other guests uncomfortable. I asked her who it was, and she hesitated just long enough that I already knew before she said the name. I set my pen down on the desk. I took one slow breath. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out to greet my family for the first time in 7 years. My father was standing in the center of the lobby with both arms crossed, wearing a blazer that used to fit him better. He had gained weight and lost more hair, but the expression on his face was identical to the one I remembered from the driveway in Nashville. My mother was beside him, clutching her purse with both hands and looking at the marble floors as if she were calculating their value. My older brother stood slightly behind them with his wife, a woman named Candace who had always looked at me the way people look at a parking ticket. And trailing behind all of them, on his phone, was my brother's business partner, a man named Derek who I had met exactly twice before, and who apparently now considered himself a member of the family. My father saw me the moment I stepped into the lobby. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge the 7 years between us. He simply lifted his chin and said, "There she is," as if I had just returned from running a short errand. I walked across the marble floor and stopped 6 feet away from him. I kept my voice at the same low, professional register I used with every difficult guest who had ever walked through my doors. I asked him what I could help him with. He let out a short laugh through his nose. He looked around the lobby, at the custom light fixtures and the live orchid installation behind the check-in desk, and he nodded slowly, the way people do when they are trying to appear unimpressed while clearly being impressed. "We need a suite," he said. "Something on a high floor. 2 rooms minimum. We drove down from Nashville and we are not paying tourist prices at our own daughter's hotel." I held his gaze for a moment before I responded. I told him we were at full occupancy for the weekend and that walk-in reservations were not possible at this time. I told him I would be happy to recommend nearby accommodations at a range of price points. My father's expression shifted immediately. The thin performance of pleasantness dropped away, and the version of him I recognized from childhood came forward. He told me not to play games with him. He said he had driven 9 hours to see me, and the least I could do was find a room. He said he had connections to people on the Miami Tourism Board, and that a single negative word from him in the right circle could damage the Laurel's reputation in ways I would spend years recovering from. Candace stepped up beside him and added, without being asked, that she had read the hotel's reviews online, and that several of them mentioned slow service at check-in, which she thought I might want to address before anyone else did publicly. My brother said nothing. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the chandelier above the desk. I looked at all of them. 7 years of silence, and this was their opening. I turned to Priya and asked her to please escort my family to the private lounge on the 2nd floor. I told her to make sure they were comfortable and that I would join them shortly. I asked her to bring water to the table. Still water, not sparkling. My father started to object, assuming the lounge was a lesser offer than what he had demanded. But Priya was already moving with the practiced authority of someone who had navigated far more difficult guests than this group, and they followed her before my father could finish his sentence. I went back to the office for 3 minutes. I stood at my desk and I breathed. I had known this moment might come eventually. I had actually rehearsed parts of it in therapy for 2 years. I opened my laptop, pulled up 2 specific files, and printed 4 pages. I folded them, tucked them into the inside pocket of my blazer, and walked to the second floor. The private lounge at the Laurel was originally a reading room. When I renovated the building 4 years ago, I converted it into a quiet space for guests who needed to conduct business or have a sensitive conversation away from the lobby. It was lined with bookshelves, lit by low, warm lighting, and furnished with leather chairs around a low oak table. It was elegant and entirely soundproofed. When I walked in, my father was already in the largest chair, as if it had been assigned to him. My mother sat beside him, looking at her phone. Candace was examining a framed photograph on the wall with the expression of someone pretending to care about art. Derek had helped himself to a glass of water without waiting and was leaning against a bookshelf checking his emails. My brother was sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I sat down across from my father and rested my hands on my knees. He wasted no time. He told me we had a lot to discuss. He said that my mother and he had spoken at length about the situation and that they had decided it was time for the family to move forward. He said that holding grudges was a sign of weakness, and that I was mature enough by now to understand that what happened in Nashville was complicated and that everyone had played a role. I asked him what role I had played. He said I had been stubborn and unreasonable when the family needed me most. I want to tell you what I had been stubborn about. 7 years ago, my brother's restaurant in Nashville was failing. He had opened it with borrowed money and mismanaged it badly within 18 months. My father came to me and told me to co-sign a second business loan so my brother could keep the restaurant open for another season. The amount was $130,000. I was 24 years old, working as an events coordinator, and had a credit score I had spent 3 years building carefully from nothing. I said no. I told my father I could not put my financial future on the line for a business I had no stake in and no control over. My father told me I was putting money over family. Then he told me to get out of his house. What I did not know until I hired a financial investigator 3 years later was that my grandmother, who had passed 18 months before I was kicked out, had left me a designated inheritance of $45,000 in a separate savings account specifically for continuing education or starting a business. My father had been listed as the account's executor. He liquidated the account 14 days after I left the driveway. He used the funds to cover the restaurant's next 3 months of operational costs anyway, without a loan and without my signature. My brother's restaurant still closed 8 months later. I sat across from my father in my own lounge and let him finish his speech about moving forward as a family. Then I asked him, calmly and clearly, what had prompted this visit specifically. He straightened up in his chair. He told me my brother needed help. He said the restaurant had closed, which I already knew, and that my brother and Candace were in a difficult position financially. He said that since I was clearly doing well for myself, the honorable thing to do would be to bring the family into the business. He said he was proposing that my brother be brought on as the Laurel's director of hospitality and that my mother and he receive a small ownership stake in the hotel, perhaps 10%, as a gesture of goodwill toward the people who had raised me and given me the foundation to succeed. I looked at Candace, who was nodding. Derek spoke up from the bookshelf. He said he had a background in hospitality marketing and that he was prepared to offer his services at a reduced consulting rate as a professional courtesy to the family. I looked at my brother. He was still looking at the floor. I asked my father if he was finished. He said he was. I told him I appreciated him making the drive. Then I said there was something we needed to discuss first, before anything else. I asked my father about the $45,000. The room shifted in a way that was almost physical. My mother stopped scrolling. Candace lowered the photograph she had been pretending to study. Derek looked up from his phone. My brother finally raised his head. My father's expression did not change immediately. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life performing confidence, and he defaulted to it even when the ground was falling away. He told me he had no idea what I was talking about. I pulled the first folded document from inside my blazer. I set it on the table between us. It was a copy of my grandmother's estate distribution letter, followed by the account closure record, followed by a summary from the financial investigator I had hired, documenting the date of liquidation and the subsequent transfers. He looked at the papers. He did not pick them up. My mother quietly said that things were very difficult at that time and that everyone was just trying to hold the family together. I told her that I had been holding myself together alone on a friend's couch in Nashville with $38 and no winter coat while she was holding the family together with my grandmother's money. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my father recovered. He sat back in his chair and crossed his arms and told me this was ancient history and that rehashing old wounds was not productive. He said I needed to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. He said I had clearly done well for myself and that small-minded people held on to resentment while generous people used their success to lift others up. He said the hotel must belong to some larger corporate group. He said that as a business owner myself, I surely understood the value of having the right people in the right roles. He said he played tennis every month with a man named Gerald Whitmore, who sat on the board of a major hospitality investment group called Coastal Prestige Holdings. He said that Coastal Prestige was one of the most influential hospitality investment groups in the Southeast. He said that if I refused to help my family and chose instead to be bitter and vindictive, he would have a conversation with Gerald over the weekend. He said Gerald had connections to the Laurel's ownership structure, and that one conversation could reshape my professional future in ways I was not prepared for. He said all of this in a very measured tone, as if he were describing a business transaction rather than threatening his own daughter. Candace said, quietly but clearly, that it would be a shame for something as small as stubbornness to get in the way of a successful career. Derek nodded and said, from the bookshelf, that the hospitality sector was very relationship-driven. I looked at my father for a long moment. I thought about the driveway. I thought about the friend's couch. I thought about the 3 jobs I worked simultaneously for the first 2 years while I studied commercial real estate at night on a laptop I bought secondhand. I thought about the 4 years it took me to build enough credit and capital to make a serious offer on this building. I thought about signing the closing documents alone at a title company on a Tuesday afternoon with nobody there to celebrate with me. I asked my father how well he knew Gerald Whitmore. He said very well. He said Gerald and he had known each other for almost a decade. I nodded slowly. I reached back into my blazer and pulled out the second folded document. I set it on the table next to the first one. He looked at it without moving. I told him to go ahead and read it. My mother leaned over and looked at the header. She frowned. She said, "What is Meridian Property Group?" I told her Meridian Property Group was the private LLC I established 6 years ago to manage my real estate acquisitions. I told her it was the legal entity under which I purchased this building, renovated it, and launched the Laurel 4 years ago. I told her that the Laurel did not belong to a corporate group or a hospitality conglomerate. I told her that the Laurel belonged entirely to me. My father stared at the LLC documentation, his arms uncrossed slowly. I told him that Meridian Property Group had been expanding steadily for the past 3 years. I told him that 18 months ago, Meridian had quietly acquired a second property. I told him I had been selective about that acquisition, specifically looking for an established building with a solid tenant base and strong commercial bones in a growing market. I told him the property was called the Whitmore Plaza. Something moved across my father's face that I had never seen there before. I told him that Gerald Whitmore had approached my broker directly with the off-market listing. I told him Gerald had been looking to exit the property quietly before the end of the fiscal year and that he needed a cash buyer who could close quickly without the delays of institutional financing. I told him Meridian closed the deal in full 11 months ago. My father's mouth opened and then closed. I told him that among the commercial tenants currently leasing space inside the Whitmore Plaza, there was a mid-size insurance advisory firm on the 3rd floor. I told him the firm had been operating on a standard 3-year lease that had expired 4 months ago and was currently on a month-to-month arrangement pending renegotiation. I asked my father the name of the insurance advisory firm he worked for. He did not answer. His face had gone a color I did not have a name for. My mother whispered his name. My brother stood up from his chair. He walked slowly to the table and looked at the documents. He read for a moment. He sat back down without a word. I told my father that he was welcome to call Gerald Whitmore right now. I told him to feel free to put the call on speaker so we could all hear the conversation. I told him Gerald was a reasonable man and a straightforward one, and that I was certain he would be happy to clarify the ownership situation at the Whitmore Plaza. My father did not reach for his phone. Candace asked, in a voice stripped of all its earlier performance, what this meant exactly. I told her it meant that the person my father had intended to pressure through Gerald Whitmore was the same person who owned the building where my father's firm paid rent every month. Derek stepped away from the bookshelf and sat down in a chair. He had stopped looking at his phone entirely. My father put both hands flat on the table. He stared at them for a moment, then he attempted the only move he had left. He told me that none of this changed the family situation. He said that regardless of the property arrangements, I was still his daughter, and the right thing to do was help my brother get back on his feet. He said that Derek had real expertise in hospitality marketing and that the hotel could genuinely benefit from outside perspective. He said my mother had always supported me emotionally, even when she could not show it directly, and that counted for something. I listened to all of it. Then I asked my brother directly, for the first time since they had arrived, if he had known about the $45,000 from our grandmother's estate. The room went very quiet. My brother looked at me. He looked older than I remembered and more tired. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said yes. He said he had known. My mother made a soft sound. I asked him when he found out. He said he found out around the time the restaurant closed. He said my father had told him the money was used to keep the restaurant open and that he had not asked too many questions because he was trying to save the business. Candace turned toward him quickly. He said he was sorry. He said it to me, not to anyone else in the room. He said he should have called me years ago, and he had not, and he was sorry. That was the first honest thing anyone had said since they walked into the lobby. I thanked him for saying it. I meant it. Then I turned back to my father. I told him I had spent 3 years being angry and 2 more years in therapy learning not to be. I told him I was not angry anymore. What I felt instead was clear, which was a different thing entirely. I told him that clarity meant I could see this situation without the distortion of wanting his approval, and what I saw was a man who had spent his entire life using the word family as a tool for extraction rather than a word for love. My father started to speak. I asked him, please, to let me finish. He stopped. I told him that I would not be bringing my brother on as director of hospitality. I told him I had a leadership team I trusted and had built over 4 years, and inserting an unqualified person into a senior role as a family favor would be a disservice to every person on that team. I told him Derek was welcome to submit a formal proposal to our marketing department through the standard vendor inquiry process, the same way everyone else did. I told him that as for the ownership stake he had proposed, the answer was no. I told him the Laurel was mine. The Whitmore Plaza was mine. Meridian Property Group was mine. I had built all of it without a single dollar from anyone in this room, and I had no obligation to dilute it to compensate for choices they had made. My father's jaw tightened. I told him there was, however, one business matter that did require his attention tonight. I told him that his firm's month-to-month lease at the Whitmore Plaza was due for formal renegotiation. I told him my property manager had reached out to the firm's office 3 times in the past 6 weeks with no response. I told him that in the absence of a signed lease renewal, I was within my legal rights as the property owner to issue a formal rate adjustment with 60 days' notice. I reached into my blazer one more time and placed the 3rd document on the table. My father looked at it. He looked at the number at the bottom of the page. The rate adjustment was not punitive. It reflected the current market rate for comparable commercial space in that district, which had increased significantly over the past 2 years. But it was substantially more than what his firm was currently paying, and given what I now understood about his financial situation, it was enough to be a serious problem. He stared at that number for a long time. My mother asked, quietly, if there was any flexibility. I told her that my property manager would be happy to schedule a formal negotiation meeting with a representative from the firm during regular business hours next week. I told her they were welcome to bring legal counsel. I told her the standard 60-day notice period would begin from the date the document was formally served, which was tonight. Candace stood up abruptly from her chair. She pointed at me and said that this was retaliatory and that my father had done nothing wrong and that I was weaponizing a property to punish my family for a conversation about business that any reasonable family would have had. I told her she was welcome to consult an attorney about the lease terms. I told her the rate adjustment was documented, defensible, and entirely within the terms of the existing month-to-month agreement. She said something under her breath. My brother stood again. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He looked at me and said he did not come here for this and he was going to wait downstairs. He walked to the door of the lounge and opened it and stepped out. He did not look at my father when he left. Derek was already on his feet. He said something about needing to take a call and excused himself with the energy of a man who had just realized he was in the wrong meeting. My mother started crying. Not the rehearsed kind. The tired kind, which is harder to watch. She said she had missed me every single day. She said she knew she had let me down and she did not know how to fix it and she was sorry. She said my grandmother had loved me and had talked about me all the time, and it was not right what happened to the money, and she knew it was not right. I looked at her for a long moment. I told her I believed that she missed me. I told her missing someone and protecting them were not the same thing and that she had consistently chosen one over the other. I told her that if she wanted a real relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built on honesty and it would have to be separate from my father's agenda, and that was something only she could decide. She nodded. She kept crying. My father had not spoken in several minutes. He was still looking at the lease document. He picked it up eventually and folded it once and put it in the pocket of his blazer. The gesture was mechanical. A man going through the motions of composure. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully name, somewhere between contempt and something older that I did not want to examine too closely. He said I had turned out to be colder than he expected. I told him he had taught me that warmth without boundaries was just exposure. He looked at me for another moment. Then he walked to the door of the lounge. He paused with his hand on the frame and did not turn around. He said he supposed this was the kind of daughter he had raised. I told him, clearly and without raising my voice, that I was not the daughter he raised. I told him the daughter he raised had stood on a wet driveway with $38 and no plan. I had built this from that point entirely on my own. He could take credit for whatever lessons he wanted to claim, but he did not get to claim this building or this business or this life. He left without saying anything else. My mother followed him. She glanced back at me once before the door closed. I sat alone in the private lounge for a few minutes. I looked at the books on the shelves, the titles I had personally selected when I designed the space. The room was warm and quiet and entirely mine. When I came back downstairs, Priya met me at the base of the stairs with a look that asked everything without asking anything. I told her we were fine and that the situation had been resolved. She nodded and went back to the desk. I walked through the lobby and out to the small courtyard at the side of the building where the night-blooming jasmine grew along the iron fence, and the sound of the city settled into something softer. My brother was sitting on the courtyard bench with his jacket over his knees. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the stone path. He told me the restaurant had been failing for 2 years before it finally closed. He told me he had known on some level that using my inheritance money was wrong, and that he had let himself not know it fully because knowing it fully would have required him to do something about it. He said he had carried that for a long time. I sat down on the far end of the bench. I told him I was not going to offer him a job at the hotel. He said he knew. I told him that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the fact that he had no experience in hospitality, and inserting a family member into a management role never worked the way people imagined it would. He said he understood. I told him that if he wanted to figure out what came next professionally, I knew people in Nashville who worked in business development and small retail, and if he put in the actual work of rebuilding his skills, I was willing to make an introduction. Nothing more than that. He would have to do the rest himself. He said that was more than fair. I told him the apology meant something. I told him I was not ready to have weekly phone calls or holiday dinners, but that the apology had opened a door I thought was permanently closed, and I was willing to see what was on the other side of it very slowly and on my own terms. He said he could live with that. We sat outside for a little while without talking. The jasmine was strong in the night air. Inside, through the lobby windows, I could see Priya at the front desk, one of my bartenders crossing the lobby toward the elevator with a tray. two guests in the chairs by the fireplace reading, the ordinary machinery of something I had built working exactly as it was meant to. 6 weeks later, I was back in the same office reviewing a different set of numbers. My property manager had confirmed that my father's firm had formally signed the updated lease at the adjusted market rate rather than vacating. I had expected that. The firm could not afford the disruption of relocating, and my father could not afford the public admission that he was being forced out of a building he had bragged about to his professional network for years. There was also a second update from my attorney. It was a summary of the formal complaint my father had attempted to file with Gerald Whitmore. Gerald had apparently received a voicemail from my father 4 days after the hotel visit, referencing their tennis relationship and asking Gerald to intervene in what my father described as a lease dispute with a difficult new owner. Gerald had forwarded the voicemail to my broker with a brief note that simply said he had no interest in being involved and that the current ownership was handling the property well. He wished us a good quarter. My broker forwarded the note to my attorney. My attorney forwarded it to me with no additional commentary. I printed it out and put it in the same folder with the estate documents and the lease papers. Then I put the folder in the filing cabinet and went back to work. A month after that, I signed a lease agreement for a small ground-floor retail space on the south end of the Whitmore Plaza. I had been reserving it for the right tenant for several months. The new tenant was a nonprofit organization based in Miami that provided transitional housing support and workforce development programs for young adults who had been unexpectedly displaced from their homes, most of them between the ages of 19 and 26. They offered resume workshops, financial literacy classes, and case management services. They had a small operating budget and a large wait list. I leased them the space for 2 years at no cost, with a renewal option. The morning their team moved in, I drove over to the plaza before work and parked across the street. I watched through the front window as 3 staff members arranged folding chairs into a circle and set up a whiteboard and put a coffee maker on a folding table in the corner. It was early, and the space looked bare and temporary and full of potential all at the same time. I sat in the car for a few minutes and thought about the friend's couch in Nashville, and the $38, and the laptop I bought secondhand, and the long stretch of years between that driveway and this street. I thought about all the mornings I had woken up without anyone in my corner and made decisions anyway, and how each of those decisions had compounded quietly until they became this building and that lobby and the jasmine in the courtyard and this moment sitting in a car watching a nonprofit set up folding chairs in a space I owned. There is something people say when they talk about coming from a difficult family. They say you turned out well despite everything. I want to offer a different framing. I did not succeed despite my family. I succeeded because I stopped waiting for their permission and their support and their apology before I allowed myself to begin. The moment I accepted that those things were not coming, I stopped standing at an empty doorway and started building my own. That is not a story about anger or revenge. It is a story about understanding that the people who underestimate you are not the final authority on your value. They are just people with their own fears and failures, same as everyone else. If your family has told you that you owe them your success, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not owe anyone the life you built with your own hands. You are allowed to hold the door open for the people who show up with honesty and genuine love. You are also allowed to close it for the ones who only knock when they need something. Those two things are not cruelty. They are just clarity. And clarity, once you find it, is the most useful thing you will ever own. If this story spoke to something you have been carrying, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what you are building. Subscribe to Recovery Stories for more. I am glad you are here.